Ah, the finest of cognacs. Just kidding, this is like the cheapest stuff I could find. But I needed it because today we are talking about France. France is one of the cultural hubs of the world in this very, very rich history in food. Traditional French cooking has often been the gold standard amongst the Western world for how to cook properly. So amongst the pantheon of fine French foods that you know and love, there's one that has captured my heart and hopefully yours as well. And what is that? French onion soup, of course. I mean, what is not to like about a good bowl of French onion soup? And I have to say, again, emphasizing good bowl of French onion soup. I've had some very bad ones. And I think the biggest thing that makes a French onion soup bad is not making your own homemade beef stock. So French onion soup has a wild and curious and very confusing history. It would be, I think, unfair to say that French onion soup is the original onion soup. There have been written recipes or mentions of recipes for onion soups since 8,000 years ago in ancient Rome. Because when you think about it, the main ingredients are butter or any other kind of fat, onions, and stock and or just water, depending on what you have. And you think about that, most of those are very, very cheap, which means that this is prime peasant food. So that's why this history is very interesting, is because not only does it show up as peasant food, but it also shows up in the royal courts of France in the 19th century. I want to dive into these two conflicting stories of the origins of proper French onion soup. I'm going to do this history in a little anachronistic way, mostly to prove a point, so bear with me with that. So we're going to start in the royal courts. And there are two stories from royal French families to explain the origins of French onion soup. And the first one is pretty simple. It goes that King Louis XV was out on one of his famous hunting trips, and he came to his hunting lodge, and he realized the only food he had left was butter, onions, and champagne, which is an odd kind of stuff to have, but you know, okay, King Louis. So he threw these together in a pot, added some water, and was delighted with the result. A very, what seems would be very bland French onion soup, because it's just onions, water, and champagne. He says that he loves it, and he brings it back to the royal courts and shows it off to everyone as a new dish that he created. So that's pretty simple. I don't really like this story. I don't really think it's most likely true. First of all, one thing I want to point out, if he was going hunting and then returning to his hunting lodge, and you know, these are big adventures. It's not like he just goes out for an afternoon. This is like at least a weekend ordeal. And he comes back to the lodge, and the only thing he has is butter, onions, and champagne. Like, did he not hunt? Did he like not catch anything? Did he not kill anything? I mean, that just seems very odd, and it doesn't, considering the fact that King Louis would have been there with his, you know, royal court and servants. I feel like nobody would get away with telling a story of King Louis XV, known for hunting, failing at a hunt. That just seems like an odd story. So the next one seems far more probable in terms of the royal court stories. And this one goes that the Duke of Lorraine and the ex-king of Poland, Stanislaus Leszczynski, I think it's Leszczynski, I don't know, it's Polish, I can't pronounce it. But Stanislaus was heading to visit his daughter, Queen Mary, who was married to King Louis XV. So Stanislaus was stopping off for the night in Châlons-en-Champagne, near Versailles, I think. And he was staying in a hotel called La Pomme d'Or. I'm sorry, I don't know French. And I know that French people don't like you butchering their language, so bear with me. Stanislaus was staying at this hotel, and he ordered room service, and the chef at the time was Nicolas Opère. He was actually also the inventor of food canning, which is pretty cool. But anyway, he was sent up this dish of onions cooked in broth, topped with a piece of toast and cheese melted on the top of it. Sounds like a French onion soup. Stanislaus loved this dish so much that he threw on a bathrobe and ran down to the kitchens to meet with the chef and learn how to make it. And so he spent hours crying over the chopping of onions and learning this dish, this classical French onion soup. And then he took it to the royal courts of King Louis XV and Queen Mary and showed them this wonderful dish that he had learned on the road. And it just became this huge hit. It was being served all the time. The most common time it was being served was actually after a long, long night of partying, because I guess the onions and the cheese really masked the smell of alcoholism. So that is the royal court story for the origin of French onion soup. But as I said, that's not the only story. And there's a lot of competing stories about the origins of French onion soup, and I want to kind of discuss the peasantry side of it. And there's a long history, but I want to read from 1651, a chef that, a French chef, Francois Pierre La Varenne. This is 1651, so far before King Louis XV and Stanislaus Leszczynski. He has this recipe, and I want to read it for you from my computer over here. Potage of onions, potage being soup, so soup of onions. Cut your onions very thin, fry them in butter, and after they are fried, put them in a pot with water or with broth. After they are well sawed, put on a crust of bread and let it boil for a very little time. You may put some capers in it, dry your bread, and then stove it. Take it up, serve it with a drop of vinegar. So again, this is from 1651, so far preceding the other stories, and I think it's interesting because this shows, again, that there are very similar recipes for an extended period of time. The one thing that is different is he says to add capers and vinegar instead of what we have on top is cheese. No mentions of wine in it or anything like that, which is pretty common, like King Louis XV's champagne version. And then, so going back to the peasantry thing, there's an open-air market in Paris called Les Halles. It is was a very popular market, and a lot of peasants and poor people would show up and either sell items or get very cheap food. So the Les Halles market has been around since about the time of the Black Plagues, and in the 19th century, there was an excerpt written about a woman. She was a poor vendor, and she was known for a onion and cabbage broth soup, and she would take the soup, she'd put it in a little cup, and she'd put stale bread on top of it, and she'd dump liquor over the top of it. Which is really interesting because one of the components in a good French onion soup is, and this is why I have this, cognac, just to kind of balance out the flavors. And I think it's really interesting that a vendor in this open air market was adding liquor to her onion and cabbage soup. So you might be thinking onion and cabbage soup doesn't sound the same as French onion soup. And you're right, the cabbage isn't traditional to a French onion soup, but you have to think about the fact that, again, this is poor people food. They are adding in whatever vegetables, root vegetables and things that they could, cheap things that they could throw into a broth is a common way to eat when you're a peasant. So it's really interesting, and the reason that I bring this up isn't necessarily because I think that this story captures a French onion soup better than the story of Stanislaus. It's more because this happened before either of the royal court stories, and then of course we had the chef that had a story very similar, and again, ancient Rome, 8,000 years ago, there were stories of it as a peasant's food, onions and broth. And it just makes me, as I continue with this series of history and recipes, it makes me just want to say, we need to think about who is writing history, who is their target audience, and who is being left out of this history. And what sounds like a more appealing story, something about King Louis XV and Stanislaus, the father of Queen Mary, or a peasant vendor in an open market in Paris that has a history that is disgusting. Well, the royal court story is going to be far more interesting. And in general, history is typically written around the stories of the royal courts, especially in France up until the French Revolutions start happening. So I just want to point that out because we can look at the stories of the royal court and say this is the origin of French onion soup, but realize that this is something that peasants have been doing for ages. They've been doing it with no recognition, not written in the history books as the inventors of fine cuisine, because this is something that you would find at relatively fine dining restaurant nowadays. It's not seen as peasant food anymore, but it was, and it's important to remember its origins as something that would be eaten out of absolute dire necessity and not out of necessity to cure a hangover. And I just wanted to point that out. So, I'm going to continue eating this, all of it, but let's move on to the recipe. Let's get cooking. First thing you're going to want to do is get some really high quality beef product from a local butcher. I have 4 pounds of soup bones and short ribs. Make sure they have the bones in them, that's really important, as well as 1 pound of stew beef. And to that we're going to add 1 rough chopped carrot and 1 quartered onion. You really don't need to cut it much, just enough to provide some surface area. And we're going to roast those in the oven at 450 degrees for about 30 to 40 minutes or until they come out dark and brown. You're going to add all of these ingredients to a large stock pot. Seriously, the largest stock pot you have. And to that you're going to add 2 to 3 rough chopped celery sticks and 3 crushed garlic cloves with the skin still on. And now you're going to add about 10 whole peppercorns and 2 to 3 bay leaves. Another thing you might want to do, I recommend doing, is pouring hot water over the tray where you roasted your beef and then scraping up all of the brown bits on the bottom. It has a lot of flavor and you don't want to miss out on it. And I'm just going to pour that into the pot, making sure to get all of the brown pieces that were stuck to the bottom of the tray. And then we're going to fill up the pot until an inch over top of the beef bones. About 12 cups is what it took me. I'm going to bring that up to a simmer. And once it's simmering, you can cover it loosely with a lid. And here's the thing, you're going to have to let this simmer for at least 3 hours, but I recommend anywhere between 6 and 8 hours until it comes out golden and beautiful. Then strain out everything, leaving you with just the stock. And I put it back in the pot, and now I'm just seasoning it to taste. Make sure you taste it before you season it, and then taste it over and over until you get the right amount of seasoning. And then you're just going to fill it into whatever containers you want to let it sit in the fridge overnight. For me, it was about 8 p.m. by the time I finished making the stock, starting at noon. I wised up for the second one and realized I could just pour it in rather than ladling it. So, do what works best for you. I'm gonna put these in the fridge for the night, and then tomorrow I'm going to start making the French onion soup. It takes a lot less time. So it's day 2, and now I'm going to get some onions out. I have 6 to 7 onions here that I spilled all over the place. And we're going to chop these in half, peel them, and then we're going to slice them very thin. I know it seems like a lot of onions, but it's not going to look like a lot by the end of this process. So now just slice the onions as thin as you want them to be. It really is up to you to decide how thin or thick you want the onions to be in the end. I'd like mine very thin, so I chopped them as thin as I could, but it's really your choice. And then in a large stock pot, we're going to add 2 tablespoons of high quality butter, and once that's melted, add in all of your onions. And then we're going to add in about 1 tablespoon of sugar to help the caramelization process. And then give it a stir, and then for the next half an hour, stir it every once in a while until it gets very dark and caramelized. Once in the last 5 to 10 minutes, you stir a lot more often until it looks like this. Once you've reached this point, we're going to add in 2 minced garlic cloves and stir that until fragrant. Then add 3 tablespoons of all-purpose flour and stir until that is well combined with the onions and garlic. Make sure you don't see any flour left in the pot. Then you're going to deglaze with half a cup of white wine and scrape the bottom of the pot to get up any pieces that are sticking. Then add 2 to 3 tablespoons of cognac or brandy. This step is optional. And then finally, we're going to add 8 cups or 2 quarts of the beef stock you made yesterday. Give that a good stir and then bring it up to a simmer. Once it's simmering, add in 2 sprigs of thyme and 2 bay leaves. Give it one more stir, then let it simmer for about 30 minutes. Once that time is up, you can remove the bay leaves and thyme, and then you're going to want to season to taste again. Then just ladle it into an oven-safe bowl. It's really important that it is oven-safe. And then put a piece of toast or stale bread on top. Then add about 1/4 cup of freshly shredded cheese. I chose Gruyere, Comte, or Swiss is also a good option. Anything that's a light French cheese. And put that on top of the piece of toast. And then you're going to put it under a broiler in an oven for about 4 minutes until it starts to get bubbly, brown, and smelling delicious. Then take it out of the oven and serve immediately, and pretend that you are 19th century French royalty. Thank you for watching this episode. I hope you liked it. I will have a recipe in the description.